Okay, so for my 10 Little Indians project, I chose the book, the little story, The Search Engine, and I chose the theme of identity. Quote 1. She'd been a resourceful thief, a narcissist Robin Hood who stole a rich education from white people and kept it. This represents her identity crisis a little, because she's made fun of because she's Indian and went to a white school. And well, instead of beating herself down about it, she accepts the fact that she went to a white school and uses it to her advantage. So we can see similarities about this in Robin Hood. He takes from the rich as she took the education from the rich, and they both use it to their advantage. And for the image, I chose the original cover of the Robin Hood book. For quote 2, what kind of Indian loses her mind over a book of poems? She was that kind of Indian. She was exactly that kind of Indian. And it was the only kind of Indian she knew how to be. So here we can see that in her identity that she likes books of poems. She feels like she's the only Indian who likes poems. And for my image, I chose a person reading a book of poems called Milk and Honey. For quote 3, Corliss knew she was smart because her mother was smart, but she also knew she'd inherited a little bit of her mother's crazies as well. Here we can see her going back to her mother and their identity. She sees her mother as a smart person, and she sees herself as a smart person, but she also sees that they're both a little bit crazy. And for my image, I chose a genetic type of tree. Quote 4. I'm putting ink to paper, you could say, but I don't always feel like I'm the one writing the poem. Here we can see Corliss, the main character of the story, seeing herself writing a poem, but she feels like she's not the one actually writing it. For my image, I chose a ink pen writing on paper. Quote 5. Maybe I'm not exactly a lesbian, Corliss thought, but I might be an inexact lesbian. Here we can see her find out her sexual identity, sorry. And I chose a bisexual and lesbian flag as the image. For quote 6, no matter what I write, a bunch of Indians will hate it because it isn't Indian enough, and a bunch of white people will like it because it's Indian. Here we see a author of a book inside the story called Harlan. He writes poems about being Indian, but he feels like his identity with the Indian people isn't strong enough, but it is strong enough for white people to see it. And I put a picture of Indian children and teenagers, and the one in the middle is wearing some normal clothes because he doesn't know if he wants to identify with the rest of them. For quote 7, they looked at me on stage looking as Indian as I do, with my dark skin and long hair and big nose and cheekbones. And they didn't know my poems were just pretend. Here we can see Harlan, the author of the poem book, describing himself and what he thought he looked like on stage in a open mic bar. He thinks he's not Indian enough to be reading his poems, but people think he is, and he doesn't like that. And for the image, I chose a Indian person that represents what he described he looked like. For quote 8, they thought I was the Indian I was only pretending to be. Here we see Harlan having a little identity crisis because he thinks he doesn't look Indian enough to himself, but he looks Indian enough to other people, which makes them think he's fully Indian. For the image, I chose a white person wearing a traditional Native American headwear, which is culturally unacceptable. For quote 9, I think poetry writing is supposed to feel indecent. Corliss, the main character of the book, tells Harlan, the author of the poem book, that maybe poetry is supposed to be and feel indecent. This is them kind of like questioning what they feel when writing their poems. And for the image, I chose a picture of a book of poems called Indecency. Quote 10. I am a poet, he screamed to the assembled Indians. Here we can see Harlan yelling out in front of a bunch of Indians in a bar that he is a poet. This is like him coming to terms that he is an Indian that likes poetry and writes poetry. And for the image, I chose a poem written by a Native American called Chief Dan George. And these are my works cited.